Well, when I was in college, I had a buddy come to faith in Jesus and was growing in his faith, and he came from a family where no one else had done the same. So when Christmas time would come around, no one in his church would go to church, so he would, or no one in his family would go to church, so he would come with my family. And so as we would do that, we would go to Christmas Eve gatherings, and we would always kind of process what it was like to be someone who wanted to be a light and a witness faithfully to Jesus in his home. And he was telling me about one situation, one Christmas, where he said, I was driving with my sister, and she was an adult, had kids, and they were driving and looking at Christmas lights. And as they were doing that, people had lights in front of the houses. They had Santa Clauses and Frosties and Rudolphs and whatever. And as they're driving along, suddenly from the back seat, they heard her daughter, as she was looking at all the lights and all that, she goes, but what's with all the babies in people's yards? Why are they decorating with a kid out there? And he said his sister was like, ooh, maybe she should know who that baby is. And that was a good in for my friend to have a conversation like, yeah, he is, the reason for the season. That her kid knew about Santa, nothing wrong with that guy, knew about Frosty, knew about Rudolph, that's great. But in the midst of all that, missed the main storyline. The Christ that Christmas is about, missed what was really going on in the story. And I mention that because I don't want us to do the same thing. And here we have an opportunity to see, in this little passage of Luke's, while major world events are being staged, don't miss the story of what God's really doing in the world. But I don't know if you noticed it in the text. It's kind of an interesting text. These first 7 verses, it's the most straightforward, simple account of the birth of Jesus. Did you notice that? There's nothing supernatural in these verses. There's no angelic hosts. There's no prophecy being fulfilled per se. It is literally just data about world history and geography. The arrival of a baby on the world stage. And if you were just reading through it, you could sort of organize this text geographically. It's kind of like when you zoom in on Google Maps. It's basically what Luke's doing. He starts with the Roman Empire, moves to the region of Judea, city of Bethlehem, little manger, and that's kind of these 7 verses. But if you just kind of say, oh, that's what he's doing, he's just geolocating for us, you would miss something profound that's happening in this little pastoral scene. Something miraculous is being played out within the mundane. And this is where Bible study methods help us, class. If you've never studied an epistle, the letters in the New Testament, one of the best Bible study tools when you're studying these letters is to follow the verbs. Because verbs are literally where the action is. You follow the verbs, you find the meaning. So you see the verbs, and then you see the conjunctions, because they hook up phrases and words and clauses, right? Schoolhouse Rock taught us this. And as you are seeing these arguments played out in these letters, you see where the verbs are and how the conjunctions link them, and you kind of follow the course of the argument. But in narratives, stories like this part, just sort of following the verbs sort of helps you, but not really. And if you read this one, really the verbs are Joseph's and Mary's. Joseph went from Nazareth down to Bethlehem with Mary. Mary had a baby. Those are the 2 things, right? But when you're studying narratives, often more helpful is to deploy the W questions. Who, what, when, where, why. And when you look at a story, you just try to figure it out. And that's where this part gets interesting. The 2 who's that jump out right away are Joseph and Mary. And like I said, they're doing most of the what's, right? They went up to Bethlehem, which is interestingly south. And usually you go down south, except when you're in Israel, because it was at a higher elevation. So you go down, but you go up anyway. So they did that, and she has the baby. But if you deploy your who question, something interesting happens here. There's a couple other who's in this text. You get Caesar Augustus, Quirinius, who worked for Caesar. Then you get David mentioned twice. And then you get Jesus, although he's not named by name, he's just called firstborn son. We'll talk about the relevance of that in a minute. And this is where things get interesting. If you just highlight that, something pops out. Around Joseph and Mary in this little pastoral scene are 3 kings. King Caesar, King David, and then Jesus Christ, the King of Kings. And you look at this and you go, wow, this is a passage about 3 kings. And some of you hear that and you're like, oh yeah, no, don't we sing about that in Christmas? We 3 kings of, no, wait a minute. Those are kings from the Orient, and they're not mentioned in this passage. They're actually in Matthew. Luke doesn't talk about those 3 kings. You remember those guys? Brought some frankincense, myrrh, etc. A little bit of debate if they really were kings. And Matthew, he calls them magi. It means wise men. Some people think it means magicians. Could be kings. Little controversy around them. Here's the deal. I'm not going to make fun of them or the song Three Kings, because I made some jokes about Mary Did You Know last week, and boy, some of you got real upset about it. I had so many people come up, that's my favorite song. I'm like, look, I understand that the song is a creative expression kind of pondering the beauty of divinity and humanity linked together. I understand the artistic merit. I am just subtly mocking some of the questions he's asking. I'm sure the guy who wrote it is doing fine. It got covered by Carrie Underwood to CeeLo. I'm sure he's drying his tears with his money. So look, take it easy. But apparently Mary Did You Know has a whole interest group that got really spun up. So I'm not going to make fun of We Three Kings. I hope you enjoy it this holiday season. But my point here is, Luke's pointing out another three kings. And here around this simple birth, massive authoritarian movements are taking place. And he samples these names on purpose. And I don't want you to miss the miraculous happening in the midst of the mundane, because what he's talking about here is not just about these kings, it's about how God is moving kingdoms, and that deeply involves you and your life and your kingdom here today. So let's understand Luke's real three kings. And the first king shows up in these first three verses. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This is the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. Who is Caesar Augustus, and why bring him up here? Well, Caesar Augustus, the one mentioned here, most historians agree was the greatest Caesar that Rome had ever known. He's considered widely to be the founder of the Roman Empire as we know it. And many see him not only as just the greatest Caesar that Rome ever knew, they see him as not just the greatest emperor of Rome, but many historians name him as the greatest secular leader that ever lived. Don't be thrown off by the baby, by the way. That's Cupid. That's the base so his statue doesn't topple over, and they just made the base look adorable. Stay focused here. This is who we're talking about. I just know some of you were getting lost in the story. As he was growing up, his name was Octavian. And Octavian was historically not this jacked. He was a bit of a sickly kid. But where he lacked physical health, he made up for it in political ambition. He got in good with his great uncle, Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar, you know, when he was killed and they read his will, that he left all to his adopted firstborn, Octavian. That means he got the name, he got the estate, and he got the allegiance of his legions. Real big surprise to Mark Antony, who thought he'd be in charge. Little bit of conflict there, but they realized we need to work together. And so he worked together with Mark Antony and another guy, Lepidus. They became a triumvirate, and together they wiped out the assassins of Julius Caesar. Brutus, Cassius overcame them at the Battle of Philippi. Lepidus kind of dropped out of history. He began to fall out. And so there began to be sort of a frenemies thing with Octavian and Mark Antony. Mark Antony moved south into Egypt, hooked up with Cleopatra, started to make intimations like he was going to let one of these kids sort of take over Rome, started to threaten Rome's power with Egyptian power, and so they realized he's a threat, so Octavian marched forces down to take out Mark Antony. As he did so, he kind of laid siege to them, began to starve their armies, and finally, in an act of desperation, after being routed at the Battle of Actium, Mark Antony and Cleopatra both took their lives. And so Octavian went home as the sole ruler of Rome, and that's when they changed his name from Octavian to Caesar Augustus, meaning the exalted one. And that's when the party really began, because this guy was a great organizer of the kingdom. He expanded its borders through conquest, and then he made treaties in a nation of Rome that was crumbling because of civil war, invasion, and violence in the streets. He brought peace. He took the military and made the first state military in history. And as he did so, he secured a peaceful border, and he ended the civil wars. He created a police force to keep the city safe. He created a fire department. Such a thing didn't exist back then. If your house lit on fire, that's your problem. Now the state said, no, we'll help do this. And so he ushered in a time of stability, and in this time of peace called the Pax Romana, Rome was able to reach its potential. And it began to create different roads. It began to expand in its trade. It began to grow in finances. He impacted great building works. He said famously that I encountered a Rome of bricks, I leave you a Rome of marble. that he created the borders of this vast empire. Did you notice when Luke talked about him, it says that he decided to register the whole world. That's how Rome was conceived of back then, that if you look at his empire, as he extended the Roman Empire, it covered what was understood then to be the entire world. And then 3 times in the text it says they were registered because he was the great organizer. I'm going to count people all over the whole world that he could get a sense of who his people were as he consolidated his power. The great Caesar, the high and exalted Augustus, the leader of the Pax Romana, the peace in Rome, the greatest of all secular leaders in history. Isn't that wild? Historians say he was the greatest emperor and maybe the greatest leader the world's ever known. And I bet if we're honest, I just told you more about that man than you ever knew before. Except for a handful of you. Some of you are like, well, you didn't mention his wife that he divorced. Okay, you win. However, for many of us, if I would have asked you before the last 5 minutes to write a paper on Caesar Augustus, you'd have been in a heap of trouble. You would have been like, he was a Caesar of Rome, which meant he was very powerful because Rome was powerful and empires are powerful. And Caesar, really try to work that word count. And Caesars are powerful. Like, you'd be in a heap of trouble. You couldn't fill a 3x5 card with the greatest secular ruler the world has ever known. Isn't that interesting? Why bring him up here? Luke just mentions he wanted to take a census, probably for tax purposes, because Jews didn't serve in the military. He did it when Quirinius was his governing power in Syria. I know many of you were wondering that. Well, which one of Quirinius' censuses did this happen to? It was in the first one. It's like, Luke's just kind of giving you some historical roots. But why mention all this? Why name drop him this way? Well, it's to root Jesus in history. This isn't a fanciful story. This happened during something that you can study. We actually have a lot of non-biblical sources about the censuses that Caesar Augustus did. But here's why this is important. Notice this. The most powerful secular leader in history. And why does Luke bring him up here? Because as he's pursuing his tax purposes, he creates an environment where Joseph and Mary need to head down to Bethlehem. And by doing so, does something he didn't intend to do at all. Fulfills an ancient prophecy in Micah 5:2, where the prophet said, "You, O Bethlehem Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth from me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days." That here, he's just trying to get his taxes figured out. But he initiates an experience that causes Joseph and Mary to have to go south. Back then, if you talked about your family, it wasn't just your nuclear family, it was your tribe. Joseph goes down to where his lineage is to be counted. He goes down to Bethlehem. And in doing so, fulfills a prophecy God said about one day I'm going to send a ruler who's from the Ancient of Days, a king over all kings, right? So here's what's wild about that. The most powerful man in history is a pawn in God's game. That's why Luke mentions it. The guy who rules all of this is just a tool God uses to accomplish his purposes. The great and exalted Caesar Augustus, who you've forgotten all about. If I say Caesar, word association, you're like, salad dressing, maybe a dog's name. That great ruler, the man to fear, was just a tool God uses. So who has the real power? Luke is tipping his hat to you. Don't miss it. This man has the power of Rome. But God controls a king's heart like water. He turns it wherever he wishes. And Augustus may think he has power, but it's God who determines the fates of men. And God channels history where he wills to accomplish his purposes. So who is the one who reigns over all? God reigns. And so this is a comforting thought. I'm not ruled by the whims of violent men. I am ruled by a God who fulfills his purposes with his power. You see that? It's also worth noting here that he was widely regarded as the Caesar of peace. He brought in the Pax Romana, the time of peace. And yet he did it by brutally murdering all his adversaries, right? And so he brought peace through ruthless extermination of all who oppose him. And yet, here he's contrasted with what the prophets told us would be the Prince of Peace, who would solidify his kingdom, not by taking others' lives, but by giving his own. This secular exalted one is just a pawn, just a signpost pointing us to the real Prince of Peace, the one who did it not by taking life, but by giving his. Do you see it? So then we get to the next king. And king number 2 is King David. Whereas Caesar Augustus was the mightiest secular king, David was the greatest of Israel's kings. If you ask the Jewish people, who's the great king? They'd say David. David's the great king. David's the one who defeated Goliath. David is the one that we were a loose confederation of tribes, and we were under a dangerously insecure King Saul. But when David came, he united the tribes. He drove out our enemies. He brought in peace. Great David, the mighty high king. Here, the PG version of him. David is the great Jewish king. Why does he come up? Verses 4 and 5, it says, Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. So it's making the point here that, part of this text is geographic. Joseph had to make his way to Bethlehem, so the kid was born in Bethlehem. But the focus and the repetition is about David. What Luke wants you to see is this boy's from David. This boy's from David. Why is that important? Because Luke wants to emphasize this to remind you that God is not just powerful, but God fulfills his promises. That the one who's really in charge cares. And he made a promise to David long ago. And you remember it if you've been reading through Luke, because in Luke chapter 1, the angel spoke to Mary and said, behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. And he'll be great and will be called Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Remember John the Baptist's dad, Zechariah. When Zechariah found out his little boy was going to be born, do you remember he kind of doubted the angel, and so the angel told him to be silent for a few months and think about his life choices. And then finally, when little John's born, Zechariah bursts into song, and the first thing he does is he samples this promise. He says, God has done it. God's worth praising. Why? Because he has raised up a horn of salvation in the house of his servant David. He said, God is worth celebrating. Why? Because God made a promise that one day our best king, the highest king, the greatest king, David, someone would come from his line. One day a Davidic king would come who would rule us with justice and mercy. David, the mighty king. David, the strong king. David with a heart like God's heart. David, the poet king who would taught us to worship and be honest and worship with our hearts. One day we'd have a king like David. And what Luke wants to show you is this son of David, the Messiah, he's come. He's arrived. He's here. It's meant to be an encouragement that the powerful God fulfills his promises. That he said, I would bring a just and merciful king, and I did. But not only that, there's another point about David. Why bring him up? That Luke doesn't really get into here, but he'll get into more later. And that is that the promise was one day a Davidic king would come, and his kingdom would reign forever. What kind of a king's kingdom reigns forever? Jesus gets to this in Luke chapter 20. Luke chapter 20, end of his ministry, Jesus goes into the temple, drives all the money changers out, sits down and takes over the temple of God. Pretty bold thing to do, to walk into the temple of Yahweh and say, this is my house, and set up court and start having conversations with people. And so people start asking him questions, challenging him, and then at the end, he asks a question in Luke chapter 20. He says to them, how can they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. David thus calls him Lord. So how is he his son? The idea there is he asks him the question, who's the Messiah? David's son. He's going to be like David. Like, yeah, but David calls him Lord. Back then, patriarchal society, you really honored your elders. And here he says, way down David's line is going to come a kid, and David, the high king, calls that kid Lord. Parents don't do that. They don't bow before their child and call them Lord. At least I hope you don't. That's terrible parenting. What can I do to serve you today, right? And yet, here, Jesus points to them, who's the Messiah that you're waiting for? Like, he's a king like David. How come David calls him Lord? How comes the highest of Jewish kings kneels at the Messiah's feet? And if you read the text, they don't have an answer. They're like, And Jesus doesn't solve it. He's like, think about it. Bye, and leaves. And it's not until he dies and doesn't stay dead that they realize, hey, the Messiah is not just the son of David. He's the Lord of David. He doesn't just come from our greatest king. He's the king of our king. He is the king of kings. He's not just the son of David. He's the son of the Most High. There's something else about this kid. And that's where you get to at the end of this text. Part 3, the last king is Jesus. But again, notice, we don't mention him by name in this passage. There's only an emphasis about him in verse 6 and 7. It says, while they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. Wrapped him in swaddling clothes, laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. There's two kind of emphases I want to point out in this text. Number one, notice they don't call him by name. They say it was her firstborn son. Now, why call him that, and why call him that here? Well, there's a couple things that could mean. It could mean that he was the first of a couple kids that she had, and she did have kids later. You find out later that Jesus had brothers and sisters. So Luke wanting you to know, Mary's going to have other kids later. Probably not, because he's focusing on Joseph went to the city of David because he was of the lineage of David, and then here comes the firstborn son. Because firstborn didn't just mean the first one born. You could be the firstborn and not the first one born. David became the firstborn of Israel, and he wasn't the first kid born in his family. Israel was called the firstborn among the nations, and they weren't the first nation on the block. Firstborn was a title, meaning that a parent looks at you and says, all that I have goes to you. You get the title, you get the authority, you get the power. That's what Julius Caesar said to Augustus. And here in this section, you go, mighty King David, of the lineage of David, biologically through Mary, authority through Joseph, his family line. Here, this is the true king. And all the title and authority and rule goes to him. But the first thing he wants you to see is this is the king. This is the one who rules. This is the firstborn over this kingdom. Now, what's crazy about that Luke doesn't get into here, is he's the firstborn of David, meaning he deserves the throne of his father David, right? But as the Bible unfolds, it tells us a little more. Paul tells us in Colossians, he's the firstborn over all creation. That doesn't mean he was the first one born, because he created all things, meaning he's not a created thing. Jesus existed from the very beginning. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And all things that were made by him. That you find out that Jesus isn't just the firstborn among David's lineage. He's the firstborn over all creation, meaning the title, the authority, the power of God belong to that man. But then here's what's crazy. When you look at him, where does he end up? He's wrapped in swaddling clothes. That's pretty standard baby ops, right? Babies don't like their arms out here. Like them in here, wrap them up. And you find out later that that's how the shepherds identify him. But he's wrapped up and he's laid in a feeding trough because there was no room in the public housing. Those are the two things Luke wants you to know about this guy. The firstborn is in a feeding trough. The Most High is in a manger. What's wild about that is he's the greatest king. Augustus, the exalted one? No, this is the sunrise from on high who has come to meet us. David, the high king? David, the high king, calls him Lord. That here these kings and kingdoms fade. And yet you see, Caesar Augustus, the exalted one, is a signpost on the way to this baby. David, the great high king, kneels at the feet of his Lord because he is the firstborn over all creation. But when he shows up in a feeding trough. He comes lowest. The Most High of the kings comes the lowest of them all. I had a seminary professor say once, if I was the Messiah's PR agent, I wouldn't have done it this way. I would have had him come to a big city with a lot of fanfare. I wouldn't send him to a little backwards town and put him in a feeding trough. But the reason God did it that way was to say everything about who he came to be king for. That I'm not just the king for the mighty. You won't see me in Rome. That I'm not just going to be the king over the strong, the warriors among us. I'm going to be king among the most lowly. That the most high will be the most low because I came for people like you and people like me. That the God who has all the power is fulfilling his promises to come to the poorest among us, to elevate us. Not to use my power to exploit others, but to use my power to serve others. To not lord over you and take your life, but to give my life as a sacrifice for many. That's this king. You see that the God-man, the greatest of kings, comes with grace and kindness to the weakest and most humble among us. That's our king. That's our guy. I remember for me, when I was a little kid, I often felt like an outsider. I don't know if any of you felt that way. I was an introvert, didn't necessarily know how to make friends the easiest, had a little bit of time in social environments. I remember my mom, bless her heart, bought me a book as a kid about Leo the late bloomer. It's about a lion that was just having a little trouble staying up with the rest of the pack. Merry Christmas. But I remember one day we were like in some kind of Sunday school or something. I don't remember what it was. Some conglomeration of children, and we were watching something happen on a stage. And I remember back then, a woman ran up to me and tapped me on the shoulder. Big crowd of kids. She kind of moves through this crowd of kids and taps me on the shoulder. And I turn around, and this lady's leaning down at me, and she goes, "Hey, how big is your head?" Which I didn't really know how to answer. I mean, the answer was large. I had a coach tell me later I had a deceptively large head. That's why I don't wear a lot of hats. It tends to accentuate the massive nature of it. And so I didn't know how to answer her question, but she produces a hat and kind of snaps on the back to where she thinks it should fit on a 5-year-old head, realizes, oh no, that is not going to work on this noggin. So she's got to loosen it up a bit. And she puts this hat on, smiles at me, and walks away. I have no idea who that woman was. But I took the hat off, and it was an Incredible Hulk hat, which I still have, because the Incredible Hulk was my favorite character. I have no idea how she knew that. I don't know who she is. I don't know how she would know me. And why on earth in this sea of humanity would you come to Leo the late bloomer? And yet she moves and puts this thing on my head and honors me and walks away. And I go, that is grace. I'm nobody. I'm the smallest. I'm the back of the pack. And you come for me. And that's the idea. That the Most High comes to the manger. That the great God comes to us. That kingdoms fade. Rome has fallen. Kingdoms fall. You get too caught up in that story, you miss the main plot line. Don't do it. That God is moving all of history. And where is he moving it? The God of power moves the powerful like pawns for his purposes. And his purposes are to fulfill his promises, to do good to his people who trust him. And how does he do that? He sends the Most High into a manger. The highest of all comes lowest of all. Why? Because a powerful God fulfills his promises to the poorest, the weakest, those of us who admit our need. That's the gospel. I don't come to him with promises. I don't come to him with power. I don't come to him cajoling, maneuvering, promising. I come to him empty. And he steps into me. So if you feel like an outsider, you feel small, you feel powerless, you feel weak, what Luke wants you to see is the Most High came for you and came for me. Don't miss him. I remember for me as a kid, I was so confused by the relationship between Jesus and Santa. I just didn't understand it. What is Christmas about? Like, well, it's about the birth of this baby, and it's about a guy who flies around and delivers toys. And I'm like, I am not seeing, whose holiday is this? And what are we doing here? And I got some people telling me this story and some people telling me this story. I don't understand at all how I'm supposed to reconcile these things. What am I supposed to be excited about? Who's giving me these toys? Santa's hooking me up, but I'm supposed to praise you. A lot of confusion as a kid. And then I remember one day walking into my grandma's house, and she had this little statue on her coffee table. And it was a baby Jesus in the manger, and Santa Claus on his knees, hat off, worshiping the baby. And I remember thinking, that's how this relates? The guy who can visit every house in one night, the team of reindeer, Rudolph at his beck and call, that guy kneels before this baby. You realize that's right. St. Nicholas was a servant of the true king. And I realized, well, then that's how this works. Caesars are a pawn in this king's game. Caesar Augustus is a signpost pointing you to the true king. The great and mighty David gladly kneels at the feet of this king. And all through history, all our kingdoms will fall, except one will reign forever. And the king above all kings, the most high, came in a manger. He came low for people like you and me, who will come to him in humility and say, I'm going with you. I'm not going to chase all the power and might of Rome. And yes, you can go be involved in politics. Yes, get involved. Caesar Augustus developed a police force and a fire department, some good things. You work in some places that you can help with civil society, you go for it. But don't lose the plot. Don't build your own kingdom in this world and miss that on the way down to a little town, a kingdom's being built that will never perish, spoil, or fade. You go get a job, you go pursue your career, but don't miss the big story that there's a king above all kings. And those who are wise walk with him. He's come for you, and he's come for me, and his grace is available to all who admit their need. So let's adore him, the most high of all kings, who came the most low for you.